actually pursue a policy of, of reducing taxes which apply on a set of people who actually should have been in the past paying taxes of significant magnitude. So much so, as we know, that in the context of a sharp decline in growth, the finance minister in September last year decides to provide a huge corporate tax concession, exploiting whatever little fiscal space it's created for itself. The consequence of that, of course, is that at the central level, combining that with what was a completely ill-advised, it wasn't any game changer as people make it out to be, a completely ill-advised shift to the GST regime. What we've had is a situation in which the government has attempted, in some sense, to try and manage its effort to use whatever little space it has and expand it further. Of course, is slashing expenditures, social sector expenditures on the Rural Employment Guarantee Program, on food subsidies, etc. And the other is to try and deprive in multiple ways, including the use of cesses and non-payment of due GST revenues and compensation, actually try and limit the extent of transfer to the state so as to keep for itself in a certain amount of resources, which reflects the fact that despite its effort to, in some sense, sidestep its own irrational FRBM Act, it is caught in a situation in which the only way it can even maintain its minimal expenditures aimed at pursuing an engineered redistribution of income in favor of corporates and the upper income groups has essentially been to deprive the social sectors and, of course, the state governments. Now, compare this with the FRBM Act as it applies to the state government. The state governments, it's much more severe because of the fact that the possibility of actually making these kinds of adjustments and, of course, of going and borrowing beyond very limited means were provided by the Ways and Means advances, and, of course, the borrowing limits set for the states is extremely low. And therefore, the degree to which the states have been tied down by the FRBM Act has been far, far greater than as normally presented to be, so that there is actually, looking at it from the point of view of a federal polity, the FRBM is one which intensifies the centralization in terms of increasing the fiscal flexibility within a neoliberal frame, of course, of the center and limiting the fiscal flexibility of the states. Now, this obviously, in a context like this, where we have a crisis of the magnitude that we are facing, where we have a sudden stop, so that we not merely need expenditures to address the pandemic itself, we need huge increases in expenditures to meet the requirements in terms of expenditures of a large part of the population, which is affected by the sudden stop in economic activity, for the need for resources to actually keep in place the possibility of those undertaking economic activities to be able to revive those activities as and when this pandemic goes away, to the extent that it does, that we actually are in a situation where we are talking about the requirement of a huge increase in expenditures. And the complexity actually lies in the fact, or not the complexity, but the evidence clearly points out that if you don't undertake these expenditures, the collapse in economic activity is going to actually affect even more the revenues that you generate. And you're talking about revenues which are, in April, which are 1/10 the expected revenues of many states, for example. So you end up with a situation where you have to undertake expenditures in order to get revenues. And then using the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act, you're actually saying, you better be careful. Don't actually go around spending, including ex-governors of the Central Bank of India, writing in the media saying that, no, you should be very careful that you might actually trigger inflation if you undertake activities of this kind, knowing full well that we are sitting on huge food stocks, large unutilized capacities, very limited supply side constraints. The supply side constraints come because of the fact that you're not spending and ring fencing economic activities from the effects of the pandemic such that you can actually provide access to basic goods and services. So therefore, the real issue becomes that unless you spend, there is no way out of this trap. And therefore, in some sense, it's very clear that this crisis, more than the past experience, which itself had established this, has made very clear that this FRBM is not merely absurd, but it is an FRBM which the center is going to exploit by actually transferring the burden of making the expenditures to deal with the pandemic to the states, while not on the point. And when states like Kerala, for example, decide to go to the market and borrow large sums to front load their borrowings, you end up paying an interest rate which is so high that the burden of interest payment is going to only accentuate the problem. So as far as the states are concerned, it should be very clear, and this doesn't matter which state is ruling where, they should demand an end to this regime. Now, the point is, I don't want to get into the argument which has been discussed in much detail in the past about whether this is going to be inflationary or not. The only reason there can be inflation in certain points is because there is a supply side constraint which comes as a result of the sudden stop. And the only way you can relax that sudden stop is undertaking expenditures for which you have to borrow and spend. Now, the point is, one is you need to borrow, and two, you need to borrow at rates of interest which are reasonable. And that means that you cannot actually expect this borrowing to occur on the basis of going to the governments, and auctions are actually generating interest rates which are completely unaffordable generally, and of course in the current situation. The real point I want to end with is really to say that the other argument which is coming is that if the states confronted with this situation begin to demand things like, for example, larger transfers, immediate compensation, allowing them to go and borrow, not from the market, but issue bonds, which the central bank must be required to actually take on. You actually have a situation where the central bank is willing to create liquidity in the banking system for them to provide credit to Reliance, to HDFC, the first round of the targeted long-term repo operations. In the second round, when they wanted to give it to more risky ventures, obviously banks are not willing to agree to do that, which is what the second round is not successful at all. But basically, you need to allow them to borrow. That is, the central bank, which at one point of time, I wouldn't be surprised, like the Federal Reserve decides to go and pick up corporate paper from the market directly, rather than mediated by the banking system, should be willing to pick up the paper of the state governments at a rate of interest, which is the repo rate. I would say even the 4.4% repo rate must be partly, there must be a subvention so that you reduce the repo rate for the state governments, given the large amount of expenditures that they'll have to undertake. Limits must be hugely relaxed. In fact, they must be flexible depending upon what the situation demands. And the argument that second argument that demanding these kinds of things is only going to encourage the center to resort to a financial emergency, saying that things are getting out of hand on the financial front because of the indiscipline of the states. Because if this government wants to impose a financial emergency, it's going to go and do it. It has centralized so much that already it is in a position that it demands that it outsources handling the pandemic to the states, and all it does is actually monitor without giving the resources for the states to handle this. So let's keep arguments of that kind, threats of that kind. If there's going to be a financial emergency, that has to be fought, and that would come independent of what the states do in order to make the current effort at dealing with the crisis successful. And I think, therefore, that the main effort should be to try to bring together as many states, and hopefully to start with the Congress-ruled states, the other opposition party-ruled states would come together and subsequently force a certain of even BJP-ruled states, given the intensity of the crisis, to come forward and demand that this, because if it doesn't, the crisis is going to stay with us in far more intense fashion for the period in which this sudden stop on our economic activity. I think I'll stop.
Prabhat is not audible.
Hear you, Prof.
I was going to call you, Ram. So will you come now?
Okay. Yeah. Good morning, everybody. Isaac, Joseph. We had a fascinating discussion yesterday. I sat through most of it, although I suppose fascinating is not quite the word to use in these circumstances. A lot of it is disturbing as well. Prabhat, with permission, I'll focus more on the fiscal deficit itself and look at the short-term and long-term separately. Now, on the short term, first, as Pinaki, I think, said yesterday, that, with in 2021, with GDP likely to contract or at best grow by just 1 or 2%, the fiscal debt, you don't have to do anything. The fiscal deficit reach 5, 6, 8%, during the FRBM will just not happen. You're going to, the GDP is either going to contract or go slowly. Your expenditure is going to shoot up. And of course, your revenue is going to take a hit. So that's going to happen. But I think we are talking about now not so much, it will get breached, but what freedom the center should have, and especially the states, to be able to borrow and spend more during the time of the pandemic, and both on health and on the economy, given the state of the economy following the extended lockdown, which looks like is going to be extended in some parts of the country as well. Now, the freedom for the, as we heard yesterday, it's especially important for the freedom for the states to have the freedom to spend. And they don't have that now. And here I would like to, we did have a lot of discussion yesterday on this. And here I'd like to put it a bit strongly. We have to say now that this idea of cooperative federalism, which the center keeps mouthing, and sometimes even the states do mention, is dead. It just doesn't exist at this point. I mean, look at it. We have a point now where increasingly over time, the center has kept centralizing its powers, and it looks like its interest is so much on controlling the states. How else would you explain that even at this time, during this pandemic, it is simply not responding to the states' concerns or giving them more powers in any sense? I mean, you can list so many. The GST dues is one. Even at this time, it's just sitting on those dues. Second, it's not responding to the state's demand for financial packages. Yesterday, the Chief Minister of Pondicherry said in interaction with the Prime Minister, he mentioned the state's needs for economic packages, and there was just no response. Similarly, Isaac was pointing out yesterday that this so-called 15,000 crores for health that has been allocated, half of that is to be given now, and that has to be distributed among 28 states, and the remaining 7,500 over the next 3 years. So everything to me points out as if, it's inexplicable, yes, how in this situation, the center is using the opportunity to increasingly centralize powers and take away more and more powers from the, rather give states less flexibility and not respond to their demand. And look at this situation that whatever they have done, as somebody pointed out, all that they have done in the past 6 weeks shows a complete failure. I mean, look at this one example, that Kerala, for example, if I'm not mistaken, had to borrow at 8-9%. But Reliance has used the opportunity to issue non-convertible debentures of 7,500 crores to retire its high-cost debt at 7.4%. So the result of the central policies are that the corporates are taking advantage of it to reduce their debt, while the states are finding it increasingly difficult to borrow from the market whenever they're allowed to. Now, what do we do? I mean, what are the states? And here, I mean, to reiterate, what Chandru said earlier and Isaac was saying yesterday, that what you can do is for the state governments, the finance ministers, the chief ministers to keep raising these publicly. Writing letters seems such an innocuous act, but actually it could well have an effect if more and more states, the Congress states and the other opposition ruled states get together and keep pushing. Now, keep pushing in the first instance to monetize the fiscal deficit with the RBI picking up the borrowing, which is already happening. Today, by today, I mean last year, I think 75% of the center's borrowings were picked up by the RBI. Now, there's no reason why it can't take up, for example, Chandru's proposal of RBI lending to the states directly, asking the states to go and borrow from the market at 8-9%. Now, it is really a difficult time, and over the past 6 weeks, the states have at different forums raised these issues. They are in the front line dealing with the pandemic, but there is very little support that is coming from the center other than creating more obstacles. And it looks like they have to keep pressing for more resources and more flexibility and less monitoring. I mean, that's the other thing. The monitoring is causing more harm than facilitating the dealing with the COVID. Now, looking at the long term, the first thing is, as Chandru pointed out earlier, that for the center, the FRBM, it's only a name, because it's increasingly over the years finding other ways of using extra budget accounting. So much so the fiscal deficit is now probably, the central fiscal deficit is probably 5% and more, and not under 4%, and nowhere near 3.5%. Now, and the markets surely know that, that for the center, there are so many deviations, and it's using whatever skullduggery is the word that one can use. Now, the difficulty is more for the states, and inbuilt in that legislation, I think after the encasing committee, there is a built-in deviation of 0.5% for the center, but not for the states. If I'm not mistaken, the states had that flexibility in 2007, 2008, the financial crisis, but they have that flexibility right now. I could well be corrected, but right now they're still tied rigid 3% limit, and as we all know, it is the states which have been they've been forced to adhere to that over the past few years. Now, the long-term question is, how do you have fiscal flexibility for the center and for the states? While, and here, this is perhaps we should discuss, is while showing financial markets that were so-called not reckless. I mean, because that's what they're looking for. Now, after all, the borrowing are led by financial markets. So somewhere one has to signal to the financial markets that, look, you may not be adhering to some straitjacket of limits, but yet you are aware of your spending needs and the revenue that you're raising. Now, this can happen only if we overhaul the legislation. Now, how does one overhaul the legislation? The political situation is such that still fiscal responsibility rules, and to me, it is inexplicable how in this situation, I don't know what advice is being taken, who is deciding this, whether it's the financial markets which are actually dictating this, even in this time, when you have the world over that all governments have been taking recourse to flexibility, but not the Indian government, or rather the Indian government's recourse has been so limited. Now, this then comes down to essentially to a political struggle, and for the state governments to keep raising these issues at various fora, even if the fora are limited. But the long term, yes, the Fiscal Responsibility Management Act has to be overhauled while retaining flexibility, and as I said, some way of signaling to financial markets that you will use that flexibility even while be looking at expenditure and revenue together. Yeah, these are my brief comments, both about the short term and long term, about the deficits.
Yes.
Let me have a comment, and I think this can be a starting point of discussion. Lekha suggested a fiscal council. After the experience with GST council, I am wary of all councils. Let me put it very frankly. Now, the council, okay, it has been suggested in the contest that the center, there needs to be a monitoring of what center should do. That was the spirit in which the 14th Finance Commission suggested that. Well, because center has to be accountable to somebody. But going beyond that, to look into the financial states and micromanages through various ways, etc., will be curtailing the limited autonomy the states now have. Already there is FRBM Act, there is GST Council on the revenue side, and now looking into your expenditure details and so on to have a council would be what makes you think it will not degenerate in this manner? That's my fear.
So I was talking about a
council-
state-specific council, not center.
The council.
No, it has to be a center one.
No,
What is the state council?
No, state council. I was telling that there is a re-emergence of economic council at the state level now. So I was suggesting a state council, whether it is economic council. Yeah.
I mean, a council of the state governments to look into the central government finances. I don't think central never accept that. No, that was only the spirit in which 14th Finance Commission said. Their logic was there's asymmetry in the implementation of FRBM. Center can do anything. States are under hard budget constraints, and therefore center has to be held accountable. I mean, it's a good idea, but it can very easily be turned around into controlling states further. That's my fear. I would like you to respond to that.
Thank you, sir. So I was thinking about the re-emergence of economic councils at the state level right now. And like Montek Singh Ahluwalia, he constituted another council in Punjab, then Arvind Payaram in Rajasthan, then Sumit Bose in Madhya Pradesh. So there is a re-emergence of the importance of economic councils or the economic and fiscal councils at the state level to articulate into the new fiscal contours and the new economic growth against the backdrop of the pandemic. So I was trying to explore that. Why the Kerala state government can explore that? That's a only question. The limited comment I was making.
We have been old-fashioned. We still have a planning board.
I think we have more in Kerala. Right.
I'm sorry. We have a discussion. I think now the point is discussion will join. Then we can actually set this.
Yeah, I thought no.
This is actually discussion is Professor K.N. Harilal. This is for those who are on YouTube. He's the State Planning Board member and professor at Center for Development Studies.
Initially, I was thinking that the discussion will come toward the end of the session, but in between, before the panelists will have time to have another round, I thought I'll raise some questions. Now, from the discussions here today and yesterday, there is a consensus emerging that states should be allowed to promote FRBM Act and limits not be a constraint. Professor Prabhat was saying that they should be allowed to borrow double the limit. And the terms should be very soft. Rate of interest should be low. Professor Chandrasekhar mentioned about this. Other participants yesterday and today also mentioned about the rate of interest. So, fiscal deficit should be eased, limit should be increased, more borrowing should be allowed at favorable terms. This much is clear. But then the question about monetizing the deficit. When it comes to monetizing the deficit, most of the participants yesterday and today were agreeing to that. But there are some doubts being expressed regarding the method of financing this. For several reasons, economic, humanitarian and all, there is but the method of the financing this, that has to be probably discussed. That's one point where no more clarity should be there. Then regarding the question of inflationary pressure, there is general agreement that there will not be much inflationary pressure because capacity is there and we can certainly produce more. But Professor Asreya was mentioning about certain short-term problems. That was mentioned by other participants also. But short-term problems of supply, obviously that is there in the case of agriculture. We have enough stock of food, but then after 6 months, what will do? Whether what will be the situation? Whether there will be distribution problems, particularly in the case of non-cereal food. That is something that should be discussed, particularly in remote areas, smaller towns, about which mention was made. Now, regarding non-food items, if factories are remaining shut and if supply chains are blocked, many of these supply chains are globalized and internationalized. So, you just remove the barriers, you give permission to start. Factories are not going to start so easily. So, in the case of many necessities, there will be problems. So, in fact, yesterday, Jayati was saying that this problem can be solved only by planning. You can increase demand by increasing deficit and taking the money to the people through various means. But there should be also planning for increasing the supply. Because supply, after such disruption, global disruption of supply chain, supply is not going to automatically respond to increase deficit, increase the supply of money, increase income in the society. So, we are going to monetize deficit, on which panelists, I'm sure, will have different opinions, and about tackling the possible supply constraints. How a country like India can plan that? Now, in India, we are in a relative isolation. Earlier also, we were not so much integrated to the international market as many other economies. We can live in a kind of relative isolation. But even then, because of recent certain globalization, our supply chains are also integrated to the world supply chain. So, blocking the supply chain is an important problem. Then I would like to mention something very specific to Kerala Court. We are saying that now borrowing limits should be increased, and there is broadly consensus. Now, in the case of Kerala, the center was very strict about borrowing limits. That's one thing. There is another issue. All borrowings of the state government, say, not exactly borrowing. Some of the treasury deposits, for example, which happened 3 years ago, 4 years ago, which is being counted as this year's deficit. There's no economic logic behind this, no, from the point of inflation and all. But it's a kind of thing that is leading to major problems in the Kerala court. So when you count and calculate fiscal deficit, there such deficit barriers are going to remain. Then the way you compute fiscal barriers should be relooked also. These are the kind of points that I thought maybe the panelists can. One more thing. Yesterday it was partly discussed. The economic advisor of the government of India was saying that we will not go for big bang announcements. Incremental announcements, incremental policy interventions more than enough, and that will make the global investors happy. And if we go for big bang kind of announcements, and if we are increasing borrowing limits, and if we are monetizing deficit, then that will create problems because investors will not be liking that. Now, many of the discussions, Professor Nagaraj and others were mentioning about the way world leaders, developed countries are behaving. No, they are monetizing deficit, and they are increasing deficit for various reasons. Now, why only in India? we are worried so much about the investors feel good factor. That's also something probably we should discuss in this time.
I will add.
1 minute.
Yeah.
I
one
think
more question.
I understand that. No, I understand that Professor Patnaik is not going to get connected because some connectivity problem there. May I request Honorable Finance Minister to take over this session? As Chair.
I will add one more question to what Harilal raised for the panel to respond to. Now, they are all unanimous. Then the pandemic times, FRBM steel limits should be relaxed, and there's consensus on that. But in the medium term, there is something else. There is the 15th Finance Commission to present the next 5 years report. Now, one of them is reference to the FRBM Act itself. We have the FRBM Review Committee report, which in principle has been accepted by Government of India. And now, in the context of the current dispute, what should be the response? How do we respond to that? Do we challenge the need for an FRBM Act itself? Or what manner would we like that to be modified? Because I don't think it is much debatable that fiscal deficit ceiling should be raised. That kind of position is totally untenable. And even though they cling to it, in reality, they are going beyond whatever is prescribed in the law. Only they want to prevent the states from doing that. Okay, so therefore, this is also an issue that you have to take up. What is the future of FRBM Act with reference to the 15th Finance Commission? I think you can start, CP.
If I may respond to your question and Harilal and what Lekha was saying, etc. Supposing we set aside the pandemic for just now and ask ourselves the question, does experience, of course in India, but globally, does experience suggest that it is possible for governments or for citizens in general through their parliaments to be able to actually work out a profile or a trajectory of potential expenditures which would occur at different points of time, potential revenues which would be generated, which of course is linked to the potential expenditures that you undertake, because after all, expenditures have multiplier effects, those increase incomes, therefore tax revenues go up, etc. So we are basically saying that we are in a position to be able to judge what would be some kind of a reasonable, if not optimal trajectory of what would be revenues and expenditures, and therefore, based on what we think is reasonable, arrive relative to GDP at a figure which we say should be the level, the maximum level to which the difference between expenditures and revenues can move. The problem, and therefore your borrowing, and therefore your debt GDP ratio. The problem is that globally, it has become clear that any such prediction, first of all, they were not. This 3% figure came from nobody really knows. This was some kind of a 3% figure which was manufactured in the course of the Maastricht Treaty negotiations, and then just was picked up by international finance and then is now applied all over the world. But even if we see that there was some computation on the basis of which the 3% figure was arrived at, the experience even before a crisis like 2007-8 or a crisis of the kind that we are facing now, even before, but definitely also in the interim between the 2007-8 crisis and today, it's become clear that any such projection of what would be a reasonable differential between what is you think is a reasonable growth of expenditures and what is going to be a potential growth of revenues can be predicted in advance. In practice, that has not worked, and the only way in which governments have addressed this is either by their own fiscal deficit targets or by actually window dressing their budgets to be able to deliver on these targets. Now, superimpose on that the fact that you don't predict very severe crisis. You don't predict 2007-8. You don't predict a COVID pandemic. And once you superimpose that, then you're actually saying this thing goes to smithereens. There is no way you can make a prediction. So all we can say is that governments have to retain for themselves the flexibility to be able to take decisions. And there has to be ways in which entities other than domestic or global finance or domestic or global corporates would be in a position to be able to monitor if governments are misusing the flexibility that they are being provided, such that through parliament, through institutions and agencies, you're able to pull back in a political decision what you think is an unnecessary excess with respect to borrowing, which governments have to be given. In sum, what I'm saying is there is no way you can have a viable fiscal deficit target imposed over a long period of time. So FRBM must go. What we really need to discuss is that what are we going to activate in terms of monitoring and disciplining measures on a point of time basis, not on the basis of setting a target across time, on a point of time basis to assess whether governments are misusing, particular governments are misusing the flexibility that they must necessarily have and which they must exercise, of course, in the interests of their people at large, not merely in the interests of the corporate sector or international finance. So as far as I'm saying that even without the crisis, the experience is clear. FRBM should go. And with the two crises, it's obvious FRBM has gone. It's now merely an instrument for of the distribution of income in favor of the upper income groups and for oppressing the states. It's not an instrument to ensure fiscal discipline either at the central level or even in some states at the state level. So that would be my position.
Yes, Ram Manohar Reddy.
Yeah, Isaac, one thing I missed out, you said something, the state governments had requested and the government has accepted. I didn't get that, what it was that has been accepted.
Report of the review, FRBM review committee report.
Oh, the encasing, yeah.
Now, Jaitley's budget, that debt GDP ratios have been accepted. And then the logical conclusion was that this was going to be built into the 15th Finance Commission report. Now, the pandemic has made a mess of it. It is so ridiculous even to suggest anything of that kind. But nevertheless, the Finance Commission report is for the next 5 years. And therefore, I'm certain they instinctively logically going forward from the FRBM review committee report, they would be trying to make it more stringent. And I thought we should also respond to that. Because there is nobody of any economic sense who would argue we have to stick to this 3% ratio in the pandemic times. Therefore, that is taken for granted, except the economic advisor who doesn't want the big bang and so on. That should be responded to. But in the medium term, we'll have to also look at the FRBM review committee report and their recommendations.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, just the screen went off. Yeah, I have 2-3 things. One, Isaac, I wonder whether, because now the Finance Commission's numbers are all gone. I think Pinaki showed yesterday that their assumptions of the growth rate, etc. I mean, I make no sense at all. I am wondering whether the states can now ask for the Finance Commission to rework its numbers and in the process look at its approach as well afresh. If the numbers have no basis, it's not just a question of tinkering with the numbers, but in this post-pandemic world where everybody says things are going to be very different, can we not look at things differently? And there bring in, it's not in the remit of the Finance Commission to look at the FRBM. Finance Commission to re-examine them. Even if this means, if they need another 6 months, or I think given the situation, that is not something that quarrel with. That is one. The second thing is, we're talking about getting them to change the FRBM, look at the FRBM, etc. Yes, but what really worries me is that the whole approach at present, the economy has collapsed. Lakhs of people are still on the highway. We are getting reports, not in Kerala, but in other parts of the country, of starvation, and some even talk about deaths. And yet, it's completely insensitive. The Prime Minister says yesterday that the economy is doing well, strong. This is worrying. What is their approach? What is driving their approach? What do they have in mind? I'm not going back to what your fears yesterday about financial emergency, etc. That's a different thing. But this situation, how does one get them to even look at something like reconsider the FRBM? Complete loss of, what is it that will take them to look afresh? I think right now, as I said, that we need to get the Finance Commission to, relook at its numbers. And then the whole FRBM issue is perhaps a battle that has to be fought next year or the year after. Right now, it's a question of getting that flexibility to borrow and spend more. Yeah, this is really, if you step back a bit, the scenario is really frightening. That it's not just the pandemic; it's the collapse of the economy. What is going to happen to the social fabric? Is this kind of thing that can just be got over by media management? There's also the worry that because that whole demonetization thing was managed and it didn't cost any government electorally, it would seem as if the wrong lessons have been learned from that episode. Something much bigger, almost catastrophic, we are kind of approaching in the same fashion. Sorry, I went off into another track because I do think that the whole issue of the FRBM Act itself, while the present situation does show its weaknesses, that battle is better prepared for and fought later rather than taking it up right now.
Nagaraj.
I think the FRBM is a long-term battle. I think if one focuses on the humanitarian crisis and identify what will be a short to medium-term expenditure required by each state, and quantify, put some credible numbers there, and maybe for a dozen states which are participating in this meeting. And having a document showing this is the kind of expenditures required, and therefore this is the kind of exemptions to FRBM required to borrow. If one gives some concrete numbers and put out in public domain, I think that becomes a useful basis, a platform on which we can take this battle forward. I think having written documents by credible people, by political backing of the opposition states, I think that would be a good way. I think I'm sure many of us can put our heads together and work on such a document and see to get over the humanitarian crisis. Forget about the issues of growth, which we'll take up later. Get over the humanitarian crisis. This is the orders of magnitudes of requirement, and we need to work on it in the next 6 months or 8 months. And that becomes a public document on which we can work. and both at the academic level and at the political level. I think that would be a reasonable way to go forward from here. Yeah, that would be my suggestion.
And Lekha. Pulin is there?
Pulin is, yeah, we'll try again. We can. We are a bit closer to 11.
Professor Pulin Naik has come back. He's on the line.
On the line, yes.
Pulin Naik.
I'm on the line, yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
please,
yes.
Please. Join us.
Should
We
I
are waiting
speak?
for you.
That's great.
Speak on. You're on.
Connectivity is really poor. That's why.
Nice. Connection is very poor.
Connection is very
Go
poor.
ahead.
Lekha, would you like to comment?
So I completely agree with you that there is a transition happened in the fiscal policy from using the discretion of a policy maker to strict rules now. I completely agree that. And given an opportunity, I would like to share your concern that we should go away with or give it a go to the numerical limits. But I'm hopeful, but I don't know how far it will be a pragmatic thing, given the settings at the center level where they give it a go to the numerical limits altogether. So if such things does not happen, then within the framework, what exactly I was thinking is that give importance to the sectoral MTFP, the medium-term fiscal framework, like for the education and health. If we have a sectoral ceiling, then, even when the drastic cut in the expenditure happens, we can protect our social sectors if we have a sectoral MTFP. So that's the only thing which I think we can do if they insist on a numerical limit. And second thing, I really enjoyed my fight with you on fiscal councils. I never thought that you have so much hatred towards the councils, but I was thinking that the central government especially, they are making a lot of promises not backed by adequate allocations. So one of the important role of the fiscal council is to highlight that what you are promising, it's not backed by the allocation, and your fiscal marksmanship is in question. So I was thinking in those lines when I was talking about the fiscal council, but I do agree that we still believe in the planning, and we still believe in the relevance of the state planning board, and we don't have to have another institution.
Well, CP Chandrasekhar, I would personally fully agree with your position. But an objective of our exercise is that we are able to bring together as many as possible academics on a common denominator platform everybody can agree upon, so that there is an alternative of how to address this humanitarian crisis. So far, the government has been so totally silent about this. So what are they going to do? And coming out with piecemeal things, and you don't know what ad hoc decision would be taken in sometime future. Because we don't want that to happen by, say, default, because nobody has put together an alternative. It's not an alternative program, minimum program, and so on, nothing. It's a kind of what is to be done in times of pandemic, a democratic response to it, which can be shared with everybody, so that here it is. This is the humanitarian response to it. This is something that would solve the present challenges. So that is there. Don't want to be surprised by somebody saying, so now calamity, nation has to be brought, supported, and therefore let's have a financial emergency. No. There should be something alternative for the country to look to. So, in this context, there's this question which I think Handler last mentioned. I will read to you the question which came up. Talking by T. Jayaraman, Hindu reporter Sanjay Sanyal, Chief Economic Advisor, remarks on the economic response to COVID-19 mentioned 3 important points. 1, that no big bang package would be announced, and all announcements should be incremental, and that big developed countries have indeed erred in implementing such a strategy. 2, that this approach has been appreciated by international investors. 3, that the economic package would be the occasion also for important large-scale reforms. So, how do the panelists respond to this set of statements?
Very briefly.
Now, briefly.
Teacher is getting ready for the next.
We have time running short. We are moving to the next. So, but I would like you to respond to this.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're asking me?
Now, everybody, you will come to you. CP Chandrasekhar, why don't you respond? Brief, 1 minute.
Unmute yourself. Unmute your audio. Unmute. No, please. Now it's ready. Yeah.
No, so very quickly, basically, Kerala announces a 20,000 crore package. Kerala says it's going to go and go to 12,500 crores. Okay. Now, which means Kerala has decided to do its own thing. Now, if Kerala has decided to do its own thing, and you want to have a state, an all-state consensus on what should be the limit of expenditure that you can go to in the context of the COVID crisis. Supposing, I don't know, supposing, UP says that, we think that even though we are a big state, we want only 5,000 crores. Are you going to be happy with that? So in essence, you are demanding flexibility. So what I'm saying is when you go and speak to the state governments, you just make a larger point that there must be flexibility. But when you come down to doing what you want, to do. So I don't think that, there's a thing of being diplomatic and the other of doing what you want to do. To be diplomatic, maybe you don't want to pose it in terms of what should be our position vis-a-vis FRBM. But the least you'll have to do is to say, let me borrow at rates of interest which are reasonable because I'm going to borrow a large amount of money. If not, you wouldn't be able to handle your own situation. And as far as the principal advisor or whatever he's called is concerned, come on, that's just a justification. He just provided a justification for what the center is doing, which is it is doing nothing. It claims that because it declared a lockdown, it is actually the greatest country in the world. And it basically is not giving the states any money, not putting out any of its food stocks anywhere, not doing anything about the migrants. And therefore, he's just providing a justification. I wouldn't even waste my time replying to him because that's what he's saying. He's saying whatever is being done now is the best thing to be done.
Thank you. Ramano Reddy.
Isaac, I would endorse what you're saying. I don't know how one responds to what the what his principal economic advisor, why he was even given that forum to say what he did. I don't know. What does one say other than respond by saying, look, the actual situation in the states is so much. This is the situation on the field. How can you say that we don't need to do anything? And what does it mean that international, has received international, whatever praise or whatever term you use? It's meaningless where on the ground people are suffering. I don't know whether, I realize that one has to hear what he has to say, but whether one should really respond to a public relations exercises. That yesterday, I believe, the member in Niti Aayog said, after May 16, there will be no COVID-19 cases in India. Cases will stop falling May 3rd and after that. How does... it is, earlier we would respond to such, statements by public officials, etc. But now there is this flood of misinformation, wrong claims, etc. I think we need to keep our powder dry and respond to the important things. And
don't you think that?
No debate. Not either. Okay, Ram.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nagaraj.
It would be a kind of a political, polemical reply to that principal advisor, whoever it is. Other thing is to come up with an alternative. In fact, this is where I feel putting numbers there. So if you define humanitarian as this, and if you want to solve this problem in the short to medium term, and this is what is required. And this can be done in the following way. I think that if it is available in a publicly available, I think we will have a basis to debate these things rather than just polemically reply. So I think we should work towards having an alternative. I mean, you can have for few states, and you say you can multiply it for other states as well. So I think creating an alternative document of how to solve the humanitarian crisis, I would be worthwhile. Not just platitudes, but with some numbers and the credible logic behind it. If we do that, I think we create a platform for alternative.
Dr. Lega.
Sir.
Lekha? Yeah, brief.
We can highlight the context of Kerala experience in this case, because Kerala is the only state in which the policy is taken in a simultaneous manner rather than sequential. What Center has done is first life and then livelihood and then humanitarian crisis. And this is going to be very costly. And what Kerala state has done by taking simultaneous decision regarding the health crisis, regarding the humanitarian crisis, the migration crisis altogether, this can be a very good model in which it can follow. But I understand that it has not happened overnight. And when I looked at the budget speeches of years earlier also, there are elements of, how to tackle the humanitarian crisis and the migration crisis.
Yes, thank you. I think it's time for the next session. And I think you should stay on because I think it's one of the most interesting. The health minister will be there. The whole heroes of Kerala's health resistance would be on the line. Now, I think we'll continue this dialogue. Not think, we will. Want to have a document by the end of the week. This during the current week. And then we'll decide how to go about it. An alternative platform of how to address the pandemic economic crisis will have to be put to the nation. We are not going to accept this incremental doing nothing and justifying it. I just don't understand why it is being followed. And there is this note in the mainstream debate and discussion. We are forcefully going to bring it to the mainstream. Nagaraj, yes, we will continue the dialogue, but now temporarily we put an end to it because next session time has come. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much. Prabhat, we missed you. I had a question for you. Something you used to write about the government borrowing displacing the private people. Anyway, the number of questions have come yesterday. I think there will be some time to this session to come back to that. Thank you very much. Then come back. We'll try to get Lega.
Yeah. Then why don't we have Nagaraj? Nagaraj, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Please.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thanks to Gulati Institute for this occasion. I think the virus crisis, the COVID-19 crisis, is a global shock, global health shock. Lockdown that has followed has been a humanitarian crisis. I think as Prabhat wrote in his op-ed last yesterday, it is to be seen as the biggest humanitarian crisis and lost lives, jobs, and livelihood. I think it has to be. I think we have discussed about the fiscal deficit or the FRBM Act quite for a long time. There can be theoretical arguments for and against. We have empirical evidence for and against. Okay, I think. I'll come to that later. But I think at the moment, what we are finding is a humanitarian crisis globally. So I think in such situations, historically and everywhere, regardless of what kind of economic and political system we have, all rulers have taken a very liberal view. I mean, if the present government or the center believes in, they believe in the ancient India, okay, where which was ruled well. Even during ancient India, whenever there were crises, the kings, they used to open up their treasury for the poor. And this is something which is, I think we have legendary stories about it. Sorry?
കറങ്ങിയുടെ പ്രോബ്ലം ഉണ്ടോന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ മറ്റേ ആള് വിളിച്ചിട്ടേ
Can I continue? Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can hear you. We can hear you.
So can I continue?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I think if you think of the kings, they used to have public works program whenever there is a crisis in the kingdoms. Okay, if you go to Bikaner, just an example comes to my mind. You have the huge lakes in Bikaner, which is in absolutely dry Rajasthan, because there's they're always, they were dug and redug to create employment and create livelihoods for people. That's a responsibility which even an absolute state took, even in the pre-modern times. So therefore, I think regardless of whatever kind of political system we have, in situations of crisis, the issue is humanitarian, not simple economics. I think that's something which somehow I think has been missed out in the current discussion with the central government. I think which I thought I should stand by saying. Okay, so is it besides the ideology? I think this is something which is coming out by experience from all over the world. I think I've been following the British budgetary discussion, and the new conservative government of all people, conservative government, has said they have allowed unlimited ways and means advance to the treasury for tackling the pandemic. So I think this is unlimited. There are absolutely no questions asked. And similarly, I think the British Finance Minister Sunak is on record saying that supporting small enterprises, what he calls the micro enterprises, is our commitment. And he's willing to put in money up to £1 trillion to support it. So, and this is by a conservative government, not by any left liberal government. So therefore, so I think there's something to be learned from these examples. I think keeping in this mind, one wonders, wow, what is stopping our government from doing it? It is just fiscal conservatism. It's just ideology which seems to be coming in the way. But what is the theoretical basis for this ideology? Is there a fear that look, things will go out of hand? And that seems to be what I suppose the inexperienced the economists at the government in the center are worried about. Will inflation go out of hand? Right. Or will the financial markets punish, as one of the former governors of Reserve Bank mentioned a few days ago? So I think this seems to be kind of an innate fear which the government or their people who think like that have. So I think we need to explain this. I think this is something which I'm sure all of us have done now, but I think probably we need to do more of it. One is, look, as long as the debt is in your own currency, there is no fear of your having a debt burden. You can a sovereign government can always print money to retire old debt. This is something which is I think is an old kind of wisdom. Okay. Yes, the only fear one can think of is runaway inflation. But today we are not in that situation. We have short-term glitches or say frictions in supplies, which is causing inflation. And in fact, my colleague Sudhana Rand has a paper put out yesterday, which showed that the food prices have gone up in urban areas, more in smaller cities than big cities. That's because of the lockdown. But we have no shortage of supplies of any kind. All of us know that look, India is essentially constrained by food and foreign exchange constraints. There's the long-term constraints on both counts. I think we have abundance. Okay, so and given that, the fear that we will not be able to repay the debt is simply not there. Okay, so and when it comes to states, I agree. The states are far more constrained, as I think as other speakers have said. But how do we overcome it? Can we think of a tangible rule which we can come forward and suggest to the center? One thing I say, let us define the humanitarian crisis and what are the expenditures under that, and say all that expenditure should be outside the fiscal budget constraint of the states. I think this can be, if I'm making sense, I think this can be quantified. What does it take? What does it take to say, when you say today we have a humanitarian crisis, okay, of three kinds. One is the health crisis, one is the wages, other is the debt of the small enterprises. Okay, so one can have 2-3 items and see, estimate what would it take to keep the humanitarian crisis out of it. One can make an estimate and say all that expenditure by the states should be outside of their fiscal responsibility act. And as Chandru said, maybe they should be allowed to borrow directly from the RBI. Okay, so I think if this group of people, if we can come up with tangible, workable propositions of this kind, with some numbers thrown into it, I think we will have a better basis to take this agenda forward. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Lekha is connected now, but maybe I better ask Venkatesh to speak first, and then we'll get to her.
Yeah. Am I on? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think much has been said with which one finds one certain agreement for the most part. I think from Rob's opening remarks, one can go back to that and again reiterate the absurdity of the FRBM Act. Although I thought that Nagaraj was saying that under certain circumstances one can find some relationship between inflation and that and so on. I'm not convinced at all. I think basically the one additional argument that has to come in that if you're going to take a position, advocate a position that you don't worry about fiscal deficit, and one must also talk about capital control. Because at the moment you're sitting on large forex reserves. At the moment your imports are like a rise, your economy is down. So you, as Nagaraj said, you have both food grain stocks, and in fact currently there's another problem. Farmers are bringing their stuff to the mandis, but finding it difficult to sell them. The government of India is not willing to put them quickly, which means that there's going to be serious problems for farmers over the next 6-7 months. And the government is, kind of staggering procurement. So just as wage earners and micro industries require support, so do farmers. I think that's a factor that has to be brought into the argument, that the agricultural sector needs substantial support at this point. And obviously, the centre has taken a position generally that it doesn't really matter what happens to the ordinary Indians. And let's face it, we're not talking in some ideal world. We're talking in the real world where the most striking feature of the centre's response to the crisis has been callousness. Utter callousness in respect to the migrant workers, utter callousness in respect to the daily wage earners across the country, and of course, complete indifference to the requirement of the states. Tamil Nadu government is certainly no strong opponent of the centre, has written a desperate letter yesterday. Panichami has written a letter to the centre saying, give us the freedom to increase our fiscal deficit 4.5% of the state domestic product. You would not have imagined Panichami writing that, say, 1 or 2 years ago. So I think in the all sectors which have been badly affected by the centre's policies, which I would not really call, it's not just fiscal conservatism. It's a policy of positive obstructionism, preventing state governments from doing what they were trying to do, okay, given their knowledge of the local circumstances. Not coming in the way. I mean, look at the latest story on the test kits. What's happening on that? Every single move of the state governments to do something has been stymied by the centre's mindless intervention and micromanagement. So we are dealing with a much larger issue. I think in a sense Ram already talked about it a bit, because if you talk about centralization, it is not just financial centralization. I mean, of course, extreme act of demonetization, forget that. That is part of the disaster we're facing. Look at what's happening in education. All along the line, this government in the center believes that the states, need not have any power. It'll basically. So we have to accept that that's the kind of enemy we are facing, and we have to really be serious about this business of bringing states together to fight. It's not going to be easy, but I don't see any other way out except what has been suggested by many speakers. I do want to say, though, that on the FRBM Act, the other point, a bit of reference to it. I mean, especially if you look at the last 18 months, from the time that the absolutely meaningless July 2019 budget was presented, what I call non-budget, followed by September, the corporates coming out and saying, oh, we can't sell biscuit packets for 5 rupees. Then you had the series of concessions, 1.47 lakh crores for tax reduction, 22%, 40,000 crores for exports, 20,000 crores for real estate and land, and housing. But totally, I calculated 2.25 lakh crores before the budget, and then in the budget, 65,000 crores direct tax remission. So you have a 3 lakh crore giveaway before the budget, with the budget of 2020-21. All the numbers have become meaningless. Somebody talked about 3.3% fiscal deficit. This is pretty absurd, right? I mean, these government numbers have no credibility whatsoever. You remember the figures that they put out first in the 1920 budget, again in 2021 budget. Jayati and Swarajit and Shumi others have exposed these numbers several times over. So in a sense, it's a problem talking about numbers with this government. We just don't know what the numbers really mean. Whatever we can assess is that, yes, this is a period in which fiscal deficit definitely should not. Globally, you are in a downturn, hardly any prospect of inflation across the board. As I said, as Nagaraj said, in selective sectors, because of temporary bottlenecks, we can have some short-term rise in prices, but there's no question of a general rate of inflation, especially when oil prices are also falling. Although this government has the unique distinction of never passing on the oil price declines to the people, but to keep adding excise duties is its revenue. And this is, again, you have seen the behavior of the government's last 6-7 years, and I do not expect their mindset to change. It's not even about who's advising them. It's basically about a logic of centralizing power in all respects, not just economic, education, healthcare, day-to-day micromanagement. I think this is what we are up against. So while I especially endorse the comments made by both Chandru and Ram, I think we also need to recognize that we have to make efforts beyond the state governments with the general public. We need a very massive campaign, the general public, on the importance of restructuring center-state fiscal relations and broader center-state relations. We need to bring political parties on board for that purpose. Unfortunately, most political parties in this country have a track record of not having a particularly good stand on center-state relations. Of course, the regional parties will play a positive role, potentially a positive role. One has to think of how to bring them on board in this fight. Congress at the moment may in fact join, but it's always an uncertain ally in this respect. But for the time being, yes, but possibly we can bring them on board. Certain demands, as was discussed yesterday, and there on the panel. Although he was very careful to make the contradiction between the neoliberals and the left without stating exactly where the Congress stood. I think that I don't really, I can't really add much more to what has been said by other experts here. I endorse pretty much all that has been said. I do want to say that we should recognize the basic fallacy of the incentive act. Because every time, you have a fiscal deficit, you have an FRBM act, but theoretically, you could still raise expenditures, you could mobilize resources. So when it comes to mobilizing resources, you are told, no, you can't do that. You can't tax the rich because that's the effects. And so what is the politically acceptable rate of taxation? There's no discussion on this. So I'm saying that we must first demand in the parliament and these white papers on what has happened with all the concessions we gave, what were the benefits expected, what were the benefits accrued. Even a simple white paper on these grounds has never been given to the parliament so far. So we must make the governments accountable for their claims about incentive effects of reductions, as opposed to the far more efficacious way of empowering people with purchasing power and assets. So, I mean, beyond the long-term issues of asset redistribution, which I'm not going here, at the very minimum, we should ask if we can defer the tax concessions given to the corporates by a couple of fiscal years. We have to implement it immediately. But other things can be put on hold. The DAs of employees can be put on hold. Why don't we put the tax incentives offered to the corporates on hold for a couple of years? I mean, there are other ways of trying and mobilizing resources for the center. But more important, I think, we must demand much more non-discretionary transfers to states in the center. Unfortunately, the 15th Commission transmission is going just the wrong way about it. 14th transmission was an advance, but 15th transmission is a retreat. We have to keep that also in mind when we are discussing. Stop there for now. I can hear you. Yeah, Prabhat, I can hear you.
Is Lekha here now?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, can you please make your presentation?
Definitely. I lost the flow, but we emerged from things. So what I quickly do is that just let me flag a few things, 5 points I wanted to speak rather than going for that full-fledged preparation I had. So first, I want to flag about the role of institutions in amending the FRBM. And yesterday, I had a conversation with Bloomberg regarding the emergence of a kind of new economic councils at the state level. And it's quite a new trend. So I think we must explore this. And Center is right now doing is they're basking on the borrowed glory of what states are doing well. So I think the states should take a lead. States should take a lead in constituting a fiscal council. That's what I want to flag right now. And we cannot wait for that fallacy of aggregation to happen once again, that the center will constitute a fiscal council and it is going to be just homogeneous. So I would like Isaac Sir to explore the importance of the fiscal council and the mandate of the fiscal council. I thought quickly 4 points. The first, when we articulate about a new FRBM, of course, we have to grapple with the new levels of deficit. And yesterday, you rightly pointed out that it could be 5%, but again, we are getting into another numeric limits. We have to be extremely cautious that this 5% will be helpful, because here we are getting an opportunity in this crisis to go beyond the growth paradigm. Whenever we talked about the fiscal rules, our ultimate ambition or the aim was to have an economic growth, but this is primarily a human tragedy. So this is the point, this is the crisis in which we are getting a new paradigm shift, in which when we frame the new FRBM, it has to be on the new growth plus paradigm. We cannot just work out with the growth parameters and arrive at the new number, which is 5% or 6%, but it has to be growth plus the humanitarian crisis which we need to tackle, and what could be that new level of the numeric limit. If you insist on a numeric limit, that's what I think the macroeconomic framework which we have to think of. Second is which deficit. This also we are quite grappling with, because we started with a primary deficit long back, primarily a purpose-specific deficit then later, and now we are finding the importance of the monetized deficit once again. So which deficit we have to articulate in the new FRBM framework, which we have to give emphasis, because I remember that controversy or the dissent note by Arvind Subramaniam in the FRBM committee on that quite a debate between the primary deficit as well as fiscal deficit. But now what we are floating is the importance of, or the re-emergence of, the monetized deficit. So this takes me to the financing pattern of the deficit, and I quite disagree with what Sudipto has spoken yesterday, that the financing pattern of deficit, whether it is synerate financing or whether it is bond financing, it's quite significant only from a political economy perspective, but not from a macroeconomic perspective. That's a point he flagged yesterday, but I think it's quite relevant both from the political economy perspective and the macroeconomic perspective, because we cannot go for an excessive mode of financing the deficit, because any excessive mode has its own macroeconomic consequences, and it's quite separate. It may not be inflationary, it may not be the pressure on the interest rate, but that is both political economy and the macroeconomic consequences. And this debate, it's not really confined to our country. I attended the American Economic Association conference last year in Atlanta. There, the presidential lecture by Oliver Blanchard, he was exploring this. When there is a low interest rate regime, we can just say goodbye, or just say, or just keep it. If you are insisting that we should have a fiscal rule, but just keep it, but don't entertain it. That's what he, emphasized, because when R is greater than G, then it's a problem. And yesterday rightly pointed out by Isaac Sir that our R is going to be greater than G, that's going to be a debt unsustainable situation. And here, invoking the escape clause will not help us either. So, and there is quite a bit of ambiguity at the subnational level, how we have to use, or whether the escape clause itself exists for the subnational level. That itself is an ambiguity in the FRBM committee report. And we have two FRBMs now. The new FRBM has gone away with the revenue deficit. So when we are thinking about the new one, we should also think about an excessive deficit procedure. Allow the states to go beyond the numeric limit, but should have a roadmap or an excessive deficit procedure map in which we have a clear articulation that we will get back to the original position within a certain period of time, and this is my plan. So that's another important thing. So these are the quick things I thought about. Like when we talk about the debt and deficit, we can also play around with the structure of the debt, like the Operation Twist, which was floated by the RBI. Like we can play around with the maturity pattern. Like if you have a long-term bond structure, then we need not worry about the refinancing strategies or the risk strategies in the short run. So, to wind up, usually we have done expenditure compression rather than tax buoyancy in arriving at our deficit targets. And we thought that the fiscal discipline is growth enhancing, but we over-adjusted so far and it has suffered, and we have suffered, our growth has suffered. And now, as a human tragedy that's we are going to deal with and economic disruptions, I think we need to explore the seigniorage financing once again. And this is quite an articulation among the monetary policy authorities also in the form of helicopter money by the Ben Bernanke. He's called the helicopter Ben. So this is coming up globally, and we must explore that it's not a free lunch. We must explore the importance of this change in high-powered money to GDP. That's the seigniorage financing of deficit, and we should have a threshold in our mind, but not like a seigniorage forever. But the seigniorage Laffer curve can give us a threshold regarding how much we can finance through the seigniorage, but there is a shift. There should be a shift in the financing pattern of deficit from bond financing to internal monetized financing of deficit, but never explore the financial oligarchy once again, dealing with the financing of deficit by going IMF. Thank you.